Thank you, Mrs. Jones. Let's take our Bibles and turn to Isaiah 40 tonight, and we'll continue in our study of intimacy with the Lord. And this will be, I believe, the fifth message in that series. We looked at the beginning dealing with the degrees of intimacy, the circles. We saw the Old Testament dealing with Moses and the nation of Israel, and then we saw in the New Testament the disciples, and each degree or each circle of intimacy, we pointed out the fact that we're as close to the Lord as we want to be. And the intimacy with God, the deepest degree of intimacy, is not based upon the fact that God played favorites, but rather He was honoring those that were simply honoring Him. And then we looked at how this intimacy can be cultivated, and it's through worship. And we're going to be going into, in another time, looking at this matter of worship, because I would really love to see if the Bible is placing any kind of degree of importance upon worship, and it does, then it would behoove us to have a worship service that would reflect the worship as described in the Bible. But worship is what's going to cultivate our intimacy with the Lord. And we saw that that will occur primarily through knowing Jesus. And that happens when knowing Him, being saturated with the Word. Knowing the living Word through the written Word allows us the ability to properly worship. And worship is that which is going to help us in cultivating intimacy with the Lord. Well, tonight I want us to look at this matter of what intimacy with the Lord, what it will produce. And one of the significant things is it will produce a better understanding and awareness of God. It will magnify the greatness of God. God is great. But we tend to only view that through human-like terms because that's how we are made and that's how we tend to relate. But if we are not careful, all of us can easily fall into a trap of looking at God and viewing God and having an understanding of God that is nothing like God. Intimacy, the closer we get to the Lord, the greater that not necessarily God becomes, but we see the greatness of the God that truly is. And so looking at the book of Isaiah, it's a book that has 66 chapters, and it is a book that is all about encountering God. And if you were to go through the book of Isaiah, you can find encounters with God that can really be an encouragement to our own experience. We start out in chapter number 1. You don't need to turn there, but you find and you're reminded as God sets the scene how He is really bothered and has very little tolerance with a lifeless spiritual activity. And it's always interesting, too, how God opens up many of His books. In Isaiah chapter 1, He opens up on a negative note. You know, people who talk about we only want the love aspect. You can't know God so loved the world if you don't know why God sent His only begotten Son, because there's a sin problem. He opens up in Isaiah chapter 1 with a condemnation for those who are involved in a spiritual activity and ministry, but without the life of God through and through. He condemns it. And so that's really the setting. 1 Corinthians opens basically the same way. You'd think that they'd get a few paragraphs into 1 Corinthians before they bring up something negative. I was always taught in speech, don't ever begin a speech with something negative. But God opens up 1 Corinthians chapter 1 saying, we got problems. Well, you're never going to have real positivity until you deal with true negativity, and that's what God is doing. And He's setting the stage for an encounter. Why? Because in chapter number 6, Isaiah, and Brother Lebee brought this out in our men's prayer meeting a couple of Sundays ago, in Isaiah chapter 6, but Isaiah had an encounter with God. And he's giving several messages. In chapter 5, he is saying, woe to the nation. Woe is a message. He's giving a sermon about their attitude, a sermon about their activity. And then he sees God high and lifted up. And he says, woe is me. And Isaiah gets a glimpse of God. He has an awakening. He sees God, he sees himself, and he sees the world. And when you and I really see God for who He is, it will affect how we see ourselves. And it will affect how we see the world. He said, "Woe is me, for I'm a man of unclean lips." So what happens in chapter 6? God cleanses him. God draws Isaiah near to him. And God gives him an experience that he never had before. Well, in the latter portion of the book of Isaiah, then you find Isaiah, and he's confronting and communicating a very discouraged people of God. A people that God is chastening and dealing with. Why? Because God does not tolerate any kind of spiritual pretense that is void of life, genuine life that comes from God. Well, if we want to give a basic breakdown of the book of Isaiah, you can look at it in two parts. The first part is chapter 1 through 39, and it's really dealing with the judgment of God. 39 chapters are dealing with the judgment because God's people were under chastisement. God's dealing with them. And then we find in chapters 40 through chapter 66, the end of the book, he's dealing with the concepts of deliverance. All that saving, salvation, rescuing, deliverance, all that entails. Well, in chapter 40, where we're going to be for a few moments tonight, we're going to look at the incredible aspect of God in His transcendence. And we're going to get to that here in just a moment. Notice in verse number 1 of chapter 40, it opens with, "Comfort ye, my people, saith your God." And again, remember, I want the positive, I want the encouragement. Well, 39 long chapters dealt with God's judgment and chastening. He's not done with them. He's just helping them to see why He's dealing so severely with them. And if you want to get to the comfort, you have to accept God's perspective on their heart. And so here He says, comfort ye, my people, saith your God." God's tender in His attitude. God's tenderness in His attitude is seen. See, He's speaking to the people of God who are definitely chastened by God. And we find the repetition. Anytime God repeats a word, comfort ye, it's for emphasis. And this word comfort or comforted or comforts is going to be found 13 times in the remainder of the book. And so it's a significant aspect to God dealing with His people in experiencing deliverance. Verse 2, it says, "Speak ye comfortably." In other words, He's saying, speak kindly to Jerusalem now, Isaiah, "and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned." So now he's speaking about the promise of pardon. God is being very tender in His attitude. He's tough on sin. That's the first portion of the book. But He's also tender in His attitude. And here's a promise of forgiveness and pardon. And then in verses 3 and 4, He says, "The voice of him that crieth in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain." In this tender attitude of God, we see after one understands God's view concerning their heart and their indifference and their apathy, God promises forgiveness and pardon. And then in verses 3 and 4, He's dealing with the essential preparation that is necessary. There's an essential preparation. See, what Isaiah is saying is, if you want the glory of God to come back in to your life, the way He had once revealed it, then here's what you have to do. You have to prepare ye the way of the Lord. You have to make straight in the desert a highway for our God. So He says there has to be preparation. If we're going to have revival, there has to be preparation. Now, in the eastern part of the world, whenever a victorious general would come back from conquest, history tells us of numerous efforts were made to create a highway or a path. in these deserts, in these trackless deserts, so that there can be this conquering parade or this parade for the conquering hero to come in on. It's kind of like rolling out the red carpet. And he tells us that in verse number 3 of a voice of one crying in the wilderness. And of course, we know this to be the prophecy of John the Baptist. What did John the Baptist do? Well, his ministry was rolling out the red carpet for Jesus, but it was also getting the people to see that there must be preparation in your life in order to receive the glory of the Lord. You know why Jesus was crucified? Because he came unto his own, and his own received him not. And so John the Baptist is saying, prepare ye the way of the Lord. And so he's telling them, you're going to have to make some things right. He's providing an important principle for us as well. If God's going to reveal himself to us on a regular basis, then on a regular basis, there has to be preparation made. That's where a quiet time, daily time, that's where revival meeting time, invitation times, these are important ways in which we keep that preparation going. He tells us in verse number 4, every valley shall be exalted, every mountain and hill shall be made low. In other words, he's saying there's got to be some road work done. We got to keep it smooth. We got to take the crevices out. Don't make sure there's no potholes there. It's got to be just right. So anything crooked, it has to be straightened. Anything that is a stumbling block, it's got to be taken out of our life. Anything where there's a low level and there's a rut, it has to be raised. And if there are any rough elements within one's character, that needs to be polished so that we can experience the glory of God. Areas of neglect must be remedied. Relationships need to constantly be adjusted. Ultimately, it's the Holy Spirit that will do this, but he's saying you have to take the initiative. You have to recognize you've got a part in this. It should be gone from our thinking. We're just going to sit back and we're just going to let the world pass us by, going to hell, while God's glory is passing us by because of our inactivity and preparing the way of the Lord. Let me ask you, how are you preparing the way of the Lord in your life? What are you doing to prepare the way of the Lord? How much of God's glory do you see on a daily basis? Are you seeing enough of God's glory? Are we content with where we are? We must be preparing the way. Do you know what Isaiah, do you know that he came a little bit of time before John the Baptist? It was a long period of time. You know what John the Baptist was saying? What Isaiah said in the Old Testament, we still need to be doing. Do you know what we're saying in 2018? We still need to be about the business of preparing for the way of the Lord. Then what happens in verse number 5? Read verse 5 with me, the first part. And the glory. All right, we've got to have more than 5 people. You got to get with it tonight. I have limited time. I get paid by the hour, and I only have 30 minutes worth of preaching tonight. So we're really going to move on this one. Look at it, verse 5. And I don't mind hanging around. I've got the energy. I've got time. But you've got to, if we're going to see the glory of the Lord, if we're going to be preparing the way, we at least got to take the preaching part a little bit serious, all right? Verse number 5. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. Hey, what is verse 5 and it goes down through verse 9? What is it talking about? Well, it talks about expectation of God's glory revealed. It is possible to be at a point where you expect God to show up. Preparation, then revelation. You know why there are some who have such low thoughts about God and who are experiencing low living? Because there's not been the preparation. Preparation always leads to revelation. The sequence is important. You have a cleanness of heart, it always brings clarity of vision. See, new adjustments in our life, it always brings new visions. That's what the Sermon on the Mount says, Matthew chapter 5. It's the pure in heart that see God. If if I got on your social media, am I going to see that you have primarily been consumed with the glory of God or the glory of your little world? I can tell you what you prepare for. You display that. Verse 5, he talks about the glory of God being revealed. Verse 6 and 7, he contrasts the glory of God to the frailty of man. He says man is like the withering grass. I want to tell you, no matter what business or occupation you are in, no matter what you spend your 40, 50, 60 hours, who you work for, all of that should pale in comparison to the grandeur, glory, and greatness of Almighty God. Why? Because everything you're living for, everything you're trying to promote, everything you're trying to control in your life, it is like the grass, it withereth and it fades away. But there's something in someone that will not. His name is God, and His glory will not fade away. But the tragedy is, while it endures forever, it is flickering round about us. And we tend to be okay with that. If we're going to see the glory of God, there has to be preparation. And when there's preparation, then there can be expectation. Then look at verse number 12. God, who hath measured the waters in the hollow of His hand, and meted out heaven with a span, and comprehended the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance. What a question he asked. Now, what he's getting into here is the transcendence of God. I think the sheet, I should have got one of the sheets that you have, transcendent in His attributes. He's tender. He is a tender God. He's tender in His attitude, but He's also transcendent in His attributes. And transcendence, and this is where I was really made much more aware of this when I started into the Christ Walk Journal. And in the first 5 minutes of the Christ Walk Journal, you're reveling in who God is. And transcendence was one that would jump out to me quite often, more so because I didn't quite comprehend it. And I don't know that I entirely comprehend it, but let me explain this to you because it is significant because this is what the Bible is talking about. Transcendence. It speaks of God as being far above the created universe. So much so that human thought cannot imagine or comprehend it. Let me say it again. Transcendence. It is speaking of God as being far above the created universe. So much so that human thought cannot imagine or comprehend it. This is speaking of life, not location. Now, we're not going to get through this tonight, and I'm not going to even try because I think it's so important that we understand. If you will listen carefully, I will get us done here in 8:30, roughly, give or take 15 minutes or so, but no. But I will not get through this because I want you to get this. This helps me. It helped me because I kept going through this in my Christ Walk Journal, and I kept hitting the transcendence, and I thought there's something here. I don't quite understand it. And again, I don't know that I understand it, but I think there's something significant because the closer we get to God, His transcendence jumps out. But here, again, listen to the definition, then let me listen. Please listen to me carefully as I try to explain a little bit, and I think you'll see why I'll cut it off and pick it back up because I want us to chew on it. I want us to think about it. And if you can go back and listen to this with whatever notes you have, maybe it'll help. Transcendence. It speaks of God as being far above the created universe, so much so that human thought cannot imagine or comprehend it. This is speaking of life rather than location in space or altitude. Now, God is not a body, He's a spirit. And so we who worship Him have to worship Him in spirit and in truth. But we're talking about the transcendence of God. God is a spirit, therefore to Him, magnitude and distance has no meaning. We can't think that way. Isaiah 57:15. Thus saith the high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity, whose name is holy. Now that gives us the impression of altitude. Thus saith the high and lofty one. But it speaks of that which seems to us like altitude up there, because that's the only way we can really comprehend a portion of what this attribute is concerning God. See, we dwell in matter, in space, in time. And we tend to think in terms of material things, especially when we're talking about abstract ideas. So to try to comprehend an abstract idea, it helps us to think in terms of material matters, to help us in being able to get the significance of it. But listen, here's the danger. We must never compare the being of God with any other. Never compare the being of God with any other. Now, I wasn't working this out together, but I was burdened a few weeks ago to preach this coming Sunday morning on the incomparable God that we serve. Our God is like no other God, but I think it fits well because this is what it's talking about. And I'll preach Sunday morning, Lord willing, from the book of Micah dealing with this concept. See, we can never think of God being high. He's high and above. Transcendence does not mean He's on the top of the food chain. Because what you do there, if you put God as highest in ascending order or in rank, we will commit the great folly of granting to God eminence. We don't do that. Or even preeminence. We don't do that. Now, the Bible tells us Christ is to have the preeminence, but we're not granting to Him eminence or preeminence. Why? Because it's not enough. Now, even if we were to say He's eminent, He's preeminent, I'm saying to you what the Bible is trying to get us to understand, and it's all throughout the Bible. Eminence, preeminence. Well, what does that mean? Well, eminent means that someone or something has become distinguished and stands out in the crowd. If we say we have an eminent a person in this crowd, it stands out. Preeminent means it's the most eminent of the eminent. What I'm saying is what God is telling us by being transcendent, He is far greater than any eminent being, and He's so much greater than any preeminent being. Eminence and preeminence simply is not enough. Transcendence says you can never measure how high, how far above everything He is. You can't measure Him. If we were to measure from a grasshopper that the chapter talks about to one of the cherubims, how great a cherubim would be over a grasshopper. You can measure that. You cannot measure how great God is over everything else. That's what the rest of the chapter deals with. Now, A.W. Tozer says, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. When we think about God, the most important thing that comes to our mind is the thing that comes into our mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. It used to be said, and some of you would remember these phrases. We don't really necessarily say them. I like them, but the men of God of older days, it would be said of them that they would walk in the fear of God. It would be said of these men that they served the Lord with fear. Now, do you know what the foundation of every intimate relationship with God is? Beyond our communion with Him, beyond our bold praying, the foundation of every intimate relationship with God was the conception, the concept that they have of God. That's what it is. So can you see why our intimacy with God, it really displays and helps us to pull back the curtain and see how great God truly is? Because the foundation of every man who's walked with God, everyone who served the Lord with fear, comes a concept that they have of God that is one of awesome majesty. transcendence of God. It runs through the whole Bible, and He really gives color to the characters in the Bible. It's not so much dealing with apprehension of danger. I'm fearful that something's bad is going to happen. God's going to hit me with a baseball bat. Rather, true fear of God, it's really a personal insufficiency when I come into the presence of God. Where you find God appearing to men in the Bible, the results are the same. Overwhelmingly, there's a sense of terror and dismay, but yet at the same time a wrenching sensation of sinfulness and guilt. Listen, when God spoke to Abraham, what did He do? He stretched Himself upon the ground to listen to God. When God spoke to Moses, and when Moses saw the Lord in the burning bush, he hid his face in fear to look upon God. Isaiah's vision in chapter 6, he said, "Woe is me." It was coupled with the confession, "I am undone because I'm a man of unclean lips." Daniel's encounter, to me, is probably the most dreadful and the most wonderful at the same time in chapter number 10. He lifted up his eyes and he saw one whose body was also like the beryl, in his face as the appearance of lightning, and his eyes as lamps of fire, and his arms and his feet like in color to polished brass, and the voice of his words were like the voice of a multitude. And then Daniel chapter 10 verse 7 through 9 says this, "And I, Daniel, alone saw the vision. For the men that were with me saw not the vision, but a great quaking fell upon them, so that they fled to hide themselves." Verse 8, "Therefore I was left alone and saw this great vision, and there remained no strength in me. For my comeliness was turned in me into corruption, and I retained no strength." Daniel 10 and verse 9, "Yet I heard the voice of His words. And when I heard the voice of His words, then was I in a deep sleep on my face, and my face toward the ground." You know what these experiences show? They show that a vision of the divine transcendence, the greatness of God, it conquers all conflict between God and man. See, resistance, this, just not ready to really plunge all in and get all in, and I'm just dragging my feet, and I've compartmentalized my life. I'll serve God here, but I've got a few things over here that I'm going to tell you haven't seen God. When you've seen God, you will have the same meek response as the conquered Saul on the road to Damascus. "Lord, what wilt Thou have me to do?" The self-awareness, "I just don't know if I can do it." Of course you can't do it, but He can. The arrogance, it is all gone when you've seen God. You know the problem with many of our so-called churches and worship services? The excessive lightheartedness, the frivolity, the shocking disrespect, it all evidences that there's blindness of heart. They've not seen God. If we really truly saw God, it wouldn't be this, everyone shaking their backside with a tambourine in hand, talking about somebody touch me, talking about this world is not my home, and just singing with a bunch of Southern gospel get-togethers who've been sniffing diesel fuel and just traveling around. Listen, I want to tell you, all that goes out the window the moment we see God. Somebody asked me if I'd go to a Bill Gaither concert. I said I wouldn't. One, I don't care to see some hippie with long hair singing about how much he loves Jesus when God says it's a shame for a man to have long hair. I don't have any desire to watch a bunch of Catholics and Mormons and Presbyterians all get together with so-called Baptists sitting there who are Bible believers who have expressed the Bible is my authority for faith and practice, and watch these people get together and talk about love God. And God says, "You love me, you keep my commandments." You know what the problem is? They just haven't seen God. But they sing so good. They can sing good in hell too. It doesn't change the fact that what we need is not to hear a good song. We need to see God. God is transcendent. I got another message about the Gaithers coming up here. That's why it's sticking. And it'll come back around. You just keep the needle down. It'll come back around. We'll hear it again. Because it all fits in with worship. It all fits in with worship. I just was... Never mind. It'll come back around again. We'll hang in there. Let me stop here if you promise to come back to get the rest of the story. Well, you didn't all promise, so let's keep going. God is transcendent. Let's stand, please. We'll go ahead and park here.